Hello, and welcome to You Can Grow Your Own Way, a conversation for parents and carers of neurodivergent children. I feel so privileged you are taking time out of your busy life to learn all about the ways to interpret neurodivergence for you and your child. Remember, all advice on this podcast is general and may not specifically apply to your child, so we encourage you to also talk to your GP, paediatrician or specialist to see if what you've learned will help your family. Chelle is co-director and clinical psychologist at Blossom Tree Psychology. She is a current Phase 3 trained mentor with Neurosequential Network and a NAPA Infant Parent Mental Health Fellow with the UC Davis Infant Parent-Child Institute. Chelle provides training, reflective supervision and consultation to individuals and services. Chelle also, together with her canine co-therapists Denver, Callie and Maple, offer specialised trauma and attachment-based interventions for parents, infants and young children aged 0 to 5. She was recently awarded the Bruce D. Perry Spirit of the Child Award in recognition of her provision of services to children to reduce child maltreatment, promote joy and safety for children and their families, and continuously nurturing and safeguarding the spirit of every child. This included recognition of her tireless work in disseminating Dr. Bruce Perry's neurosequential model of therapeutics, or NMT, and supporting fidelity of this approach in both her personal practice and also throughout Australia and beyond. Chelle has worked clinically with children and families who have experienced trauma and attachment disruption for over 27 years. We are incredibly lucky to have her here today, and I'm incredibly lucky that she's actually the psychologist for my children, so we're sure to hear some personal anecdotes. Let's just get into our chat. Hello, Chelle. Welcome to You Can Grow Your Own Way. We feel thrilled to have you here today.
Thanks so much, Carly. It's such an honour to be here and a privilege to be able to have this opportunity to chat with you.
It's a conversation close to my heart, talking about trauma, and it's also, I think, a really amazing opportunity to be wrapping it up in the umbrella of being able to discuss neurodivergence and trauma, because I don't think for quite a while it was accepted underneath that term, but it definitely is. You know, it's a brain's way of looking at the world differently, and so I think it well and truly fits within that criteria. It's also something that needs to be truly understood. So very much looking forward to our conversation today. So I'd love for you to just start right at the very beginning. What is developmental trauma?
You know, Carly, it's a really good question, and I think it's something that as practitioners we've got a really clear idea about. Diagnostically, though, we're really limited in terms of what we can utilise. So when I'm talking about developmental trauma, or my colleagues are talking about developmental trauma, we're really looking at experiences that happen to a fetus or an infant or a young child that alter the developmental trajectory. So things like intrauterine insults, exposure to drug and alcohol, family violence, intrauterine. What else do we have there? We have things like high levels of stress, you know, the impact of poverty, and then epigenetic. So to provide a bit of context, epigenetics is the experience of intergenerational life events and life exposure that changes the way in which the gene is expressed in the baby of the current union. So in the current fetus. So the epigenetics are the way in which our parents and grandparents have lived their lives, and the environment in which they've lived can actually alter our genetic expression. So intrauterine insults and things like that. Then once a baby is born in early infancy, the failure to achieve security and attachment. So any kind of attachment disruptions to that primary attachment relationship. And we can talk a little bit more about what that looks like if you want. And then exposure to traumatic events or chaos or neglect early in life. So, you know, traumatic events being single event traumas, but a lot of the kids that I see and work with have been exposed to relational based traumas, and traumas that we think of when we think about children of child sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional abuse and neglect. And so all of that, it can in turn have an impact on the capacity for the child to have optimal developmental experiences, to be able to then, grow and meet developmental milestones.
That's a really comprehensive explanation, and thank you so much for taking the time to explain that. I might actually ask you to talk about attachment and define it a little bit. Uh,
Yeah.
it's become something that seems to be, in certain circles, a little bit more discussed about its importance in infant and young child development, and I think it'd be great to just give a broader understanding of what that involves.
Absolutely. So attachment is the baby's ability to develop a sense of security in the relationship with a primary caregiver. Our attachment, our ability to form and maintain an attachment relationship is integral to long-term mental health. It's the foundations of infant mental health. And it really is the precursor to our sense of self, our internal working model, how we believe, our core beliefs about who we are, and our core beliefs about relationships, and our core beliefs about the safety of the world. So if we think about the attachment process, and I'm going to talk about it neurobiologically, Carly. So a lot of people, when we think about traditional attachment theory, Bowlby, Ainsworth, Mary Ainsworth and John Bowlby and their theoretical concepts, we're talking about the baby having a need and a primary caregiver responding to that need and meeting that need. What happens at a neurobiological level is that every time an infant experiences physiological distress, or alerts or cues a primary caregiver that they have some sort of need that requires assistance, because they can't do that on their own, they're little, they can't ambulate and they can't do these things. They require this primary caregiver to come and do that for them. And so what happens is, because we develop neural connections, so the neurons in our brain, we develop little neural connections based on coexisting experiences in time. So as a little baby, an infant, I have this experience of distress, so my nappy's dirty, and along comes my primary caregiver every time, or most of the time, and they scoop me up and they say to me, "Oh, look at you, you need to have your nappy changed. Oh, you've got a stinky bum." And it's all done with delight, despite the smell. And there's this positive, warm experience, and they go about changing the baby's nappy. There's a reapproximation of intrauterine cues, so the baby's brought close to the maternal heart rate. Heart. They can hear the heart as mum brings the baby back up to the heart. There's a sensory bath of mum's smell or dad's smell, or the parent's smell. Sorry, to be gender inclusive, and really kind of just this wonderful kind of positive experience. And so what happens time and again is that there then becomes this strong neural connection between the experience of distress and these primary caregivers being able to meet my need as a baby. And so as a baby, I form a belief system that says, I matter, I'm worthy, I'm important, I'm loved. People will care for me. I can rely on people. Relationships are safe and the world is safe. And so when we have that, you think about a baby who's just been born, who doesn't have any of these kind of fundamental life coping skills other than being able to breathe and regulate their temperature and have a heartbeat. They rely on a primary caregiver to mediate these things. And in doing so, what we do is we create this belief system for the child at a fundamental level that the world is secure and people are safe. When that doesn't happen, we have disruptions to that. And instead, what happens for these children is a core belief that I can't trust these people. I can't trust primary caregivers. I can't trust grown-ups, as I say in my clinical language with little ones all the time. The grown-ups in your world have let you down. And so, it's really hard for you to believe what we say we're going to do. And it's our job as grown-ups to prove that to you now as you're older. And so for these kids, instead of having the experience of pleasure and this dopamine surge in their brain when they have the positive experience of this good, responsive, attuned parenting, these other kids who don't get that, they have an activation of adrenaline, norepinephrine, and cortisol, and so an activation of what we call their stress response system. And instead of developing an association between people and pleasure, it's a people and pain, or people and unreliability. I can't trust them, and a core belief system that says I'm not worthy, I'm not lovable, I don't matter, and I can't trust the world, and I need to control it.
Whew. It's a lot to unpack there, but I
Yeah.
really appreciate that because I think, attachment theory in terms of it being understood from a broader, almost pop psychology sense is really only starting to emerge, and it's really good to have a clear understanding of what we're talking about. So thank you.
No worries.
I mentioned when I was doing your bio, Chelle, that we already know each other through the
Yep.
relationship you have with my gorgeous children. And we've had the benefit of a lot of attachment work that's been done with our beautiful children. So it's great to hear it broken down like that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
So we're talking about the brain when we're talking about trauma. And so what do we see actually happening in terms of things like neural organisation or brain development for these little ones when these kinds of things happen for them?
Yeah, this is really important, and this was a game changer for me, Carly. So I've been practicing for near on 30 years now, and my whole career I've worked with kids who've experienced trauma or neglect, and often that population is a population that have been removed from their birth parents and often placed in out-of-home care or into permanent care. And for a long time, we had this kind of theoretical conceptualization that was sat in the psychology world, but sort of outside of neuroscience. And then I got introduced, and so I really need to honour and respect the work of Dr. Bruce Perry, because that's what I'm going to be talking about. It's not my knowledge, it's all his. And of course, we've got Dr. Dan Siegel and Alan Shaw and Ed Tronick and the like, who've all then continued to contribute to this arena. And so we've got this really strong, rich, what I think now is a pretty comprehensive understanding and continually developing understanding of the impact of trauma on the developing child. And it's shifting the way we think about kids and about development. So, for example, historically we used to think about ages and stages, and we still very much use those as benchmarks. But we also now understand that development occurs in a variety of different ways, and kids will hit milestones at different areas, and that there are touch points and regressions and, periods of growth and periods of regression, and that development doesn't happen on a straight line. And so a lot of the neuroscience work has really contributed to that. But in answer to your question, sorry, I go off, I'm a bit like a politician. I go off and have my own little bent. But when we think about brain organisation, Dr. Perry's done a beautiful job of simplifying the brain down so that we can really teach this to kids as young as 4. And you know that I've done that with your littles, where we talk a little bit about our brain and how it works and how it's organised and what the different parts of the brain are. And so he's simplified this really complex, incredibly complex and difficult to understand organ into kind of 4 main parts that organise from the bottom up. From the moment of conception. So, and each part of the brain mediates different functions, and each part of the brain is being organised at a different time frame. And some of those time frames overlap. And so we know that if we have developmental insults that occur intrauterine, we are likely to have difficulties for a young person in terms of their primary stress response functionality. So the neurotransmitters that mediate our stress response system, our fight, flight, freeze, all originate low in the brain, and that's in our brainstem, and 90% of our brainstem is organised. And what we mean by organised for the listeners is that that's when our neural connections are forming, and the neurons are creating kind of synaptic connections and dendritic trees that exist between the neurons, and so that's what I mean by organisation, and that occurs in a use-dependent way. So the more things happen that co-occur in time, the more likely we are to create a neural pathway between neurons. And so our brainstem and our capacity to mediate heart rate, blood pressure and temperature and the organisation of those neurotransmitters associated with the stress response system originate in the brainstem. And then in the first year of life, we're organising what's called our diencephalon. That's our big brain name for it, as I say to the kids. And we, as with the littlies I work with, we talk about that as being our action brain. That's the heart and soul of our sensory processing, our movement, and our biometric rhythms. So our sleep, wake cycles, hunger, and all of that is being organised in the first 1 to 2 years of life. Then from sort of 2 through to 4, we're organising our limbic system. And I do a lot of work with early educators. So as you know, my work now is largely with 0 to 5 population. And so I do a lot of work with kinders, and I'm trying to break into daycares a little bit to help them understand that the role from a purely biological perspective, the role of education at 4 is to teach kids about their feelings and help them co-regulate them in understanding that we say we're angry, we don't punch another kid, or we're able to talk about feeling sad, and that we're allowed to have all of these emotions and that they're all really important. And that's because between 2 and 4, it's our limbic system that's organising. And our limbic system is the heart and soul of social interactions and our ability to regulate and understand our emotions. That said, a 4-year-old's not going to be able to self-regulate. That happens with co-regulation from a grown-up or another person over time, and through a pattern of repeat exposure to that co-regulation. And then sort of between 4 and 6, what's organising is our cortex. And that's the part of the brain we're all aware of. That's the part of the brain that houses our thinking, creative thought, abstract thought, problem solving. Our memory lives there. All of those kinds of things. Everything underneath that limbic down actually happens outside of our awareness. And it's really important that we understand this sort of stuff, because if we have a developmental insult or a trauma, or we have an absence of appropriate developmental input, which is what neglect is. So the not having achieved or being afforded opportunities for the development of particular skills or functions is neglect. So if we have that or traumatic events at any point in this period, we will end up with disruptions to the neural wiring in the brain. And it'll wire in kind of in a manner consistent with the experience that it lives in. So, if you live in chaos, your brain will be wired in chaos, so to speak. Yep. I mean, that's really simplistic, but, so we see functional difficulties in, higher heart rates in kids. We see sensory processing difficulties. We see motor and praxic difficulties. We see a lot of difficulties in emotional regulation that present themselves as behavioural problems, but they're not. These kids either absolutely can't manage their emotions because they've never had that opportunity, or they've had to be activated in fight flight all the time and protect themselves. And we can see, depending upon the timing of the insult, and the frequency and duration of the insult, we can also see impacts on cortex. So, all of what happens in functionality, the impact of trauma on the function of the brain really depends on when it happened, how frequently it happened, and the intensity of when it happened, the intensity of it as it happened. So, getting a really strong developmental history is really important. Understanding our kids' backgrounds, those early years, is really, really important. And obviously getting in as early as we can, because we want to, wire the brain in a healthy way as soon as we possibly can. And we want to get about rewiring the parts that are maybe not wired in the most healthy of ways as quickly as possible as well. And I guess on that, Carly, the brain is plastic, so, it can always change and we can always change it, but it's not equally malleable. So the lower parts of the brain are much harder to change than the cortex. And so when you've had a developmental insult in the first, 1 to 2 years of life from conception, we're talking about, intense, frequent intervention of multiple times per day,
Mm.
depending upon what it is we're trying to alter and change, to be able to affect change properly. So it's changed the landscape of how we do our work.
Uh, Talking about that, it's Bruce's words, dosing, and hearing about the concept of dosing. I think when I was listening to, pretty sure it was when I was listening to What Happened to Me, it changed my way of thinking. It's such a beautiful way of explaining it, that little positive micro moments throughout the day are the things that really, that have the greatest amount of impact. And so that's the power of early intervention, but it's also the power of parents and carers being able to understand how they can then be able to proactively assist their child.
Yeah. Carly, the work of Bruce Perry lit me up because it provided me with a theoretical framework to explain what I'd been doing clinically
Mm,
for the prior, 10, 15 years that I'd been working at that point,
mm,
where I would be out in paddocks kicking footballs with kids, or going on walks, and, my colleagues would judge me for not being office based and doing what that traditional therapy is, bringing them in, playing with them, drawing, whatever it might be. Um, and so, I got very creative as to how I explained some of what I was doing under the umbrella of cognitive behavioral therapy.
mm,
But in my gut, I knew that this wasn't what these kids needed. And I was really lucky that I cut my teeth as a new psychologist out in Kalgoorlie, as a brand new psychologist, and had the absolute privilege of being indoctrinated in a multicultural and First Nations
mm,
population, big First Nations population. And so very, very quickly was brought on board to community-based kind of psychological approaches, and the notion that, and I've always felt this in my career, that you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic.
mm,
And so the notion of, it takes a village to raise a child. And kind of, if you think about our Aboriginal community, that's
mm,
very much how childbearing practices are done. Everybody has a role to play, and there are multiple attachment figures, and extrapolating from that, I came away with this really strong sense of, I have knowledge, but I'm not with this child often enough to do what's needed. And so when
mm,
Dr. Perry talked about dosing, again, for me, it was like this other big light bulb and this big warm hug of, finally, I've got something that tells me and reinforces what I've been doing all along, which is
mm,
teaching parents. And so now I feel more like my role as a therapist for young people who've been experienced trauma or neglect is that of a conductor of an orchestra.
mm.
It's kind of more like a consultant, right? We have this kind of overarching knowledge, and we have these amazing people in these kids' worlds who are so incredibly skilled, attuned, and responsive, and can provide the relevant dosing across the traditional professional disciplines. I think there's a real danger as professionals if we get precious
Mm.
about our role when we're working with kids in trauma nowadays.
I'm going to draw on a personal experience here, and I was lucky enough. Our Mr. 8 was lucky enough to organise for you to go and train some of the teachers at his school. I think it's a really great example of this, because we were seeing behaviours and reactions to situations where, despite most neurotypical brains thinking that they would be safe, his brain, based on his early traumatic experience, meant that he didn't feel like he had relational safety. And that additional education was required for people who were in the education space for him to be able to build those relationships and understand the importance of them. And then the difference for him after that, in seeing how they engage with him and how that then allows him to grow and flourish, because he's not worrying about his safety all the time. It's just a massive opportunity. And so if we are in a position, and I also know that we're very lucky, we're very lucky that we have amazing people involved. I'm a very strong advocator. And so it creates an environment that allows that to happen, where we can actually put each prong or each spoke in the wheel in a position of support. But it's definitely like, that's best case scenario. That's the sort of thing you really want to be creating where you can. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think we're moving more and more towards it. I do think there's still a way to go, and I think there are pockets of the sector that continue to work in traditional ways, but more often than not, I think we're really moving in this direction. And I think what's really exciting is the impact that neuroscience has had on our understanding of a really early intervention. So, getting involved at pregnancy and working with parents, expecting parents in an anticipatory kind of way, So we all have our dreamt of baby, but depending upon what happens in that intrauterine experience, and even irrespective of what happens in that intrauterine experience, it is very rare that the dreamt of baby is what it comes out at the end.
Yes.
Instead, we're left with the real baby. But for young parents who potentially have had a trauma history, for example, the implications of intergenerational transmission of trauma through meaning making and perspective taking and the lens through which they see the world is really high. And so if we can get in and do a whole heap of anticipatory work with those young parents about understanding why they're being triggered by a particular interaction with a doctor, or what's going on with what's happening inside their body, or how they're navigating the changing roles that they're about to face from being young individual people to now becoming a parent and solely responsible for another, and what does that mean? And when the baby's born, understanding what the baby's cues are saying to them instead of misinterpreting them, we go a long way to altering that primary attachment, which from my perspective is the initial trauma. If there's a failure to achieve secure attachment, I think we talk about chicken and egg. For me, that is absolutely the foundational traumatic experience for these kids, and often is then, just embedded then in the further traumas. But, we can go such a long way knowing this stuff now to potentially affecting change really early and minimising the longer term impacts that happen for these kids. Look at Mr. 8. We got involved at 3 and we're still chasing our tail. So that tells us about the impact that those first 3 years had on the core makeup, and autism aside, on the impact of his trauma on the core makeup of his being.
Yeah, 100%. And, Mr. 8's brain, I actually like to explain his complex diagnoses, because he does have an alphabet, as sort of, people often want to ask you, was this his autism? Was this his trauma? Was this his ADHD? Was this his anxiety? And they want to pinpoint what it is. But I often try and explain it as like that drawer that you've got that you throw all the cords into. And, when you go to pull a cord out, they're all intermeshed. It doesn't matter if you tried to roll them up at the start. That's just what they're like. And you can't really do that for him. You can't pull out one cord. They all interplay. And the impact of his trauma in terms of how his ADHD and his autism display are definitely interlinked as well. So that being said, the amount of attachment work that we did for him has had an incredible impact if we look at what he was like when he first arrived in our family, and where he's at now. And the beauty of, we had a meltdown a few weeks ago at the NGV, but I was able to connect to him in a way where I could have him physically on my knee, I could rock him, I could sing to him, and we could create relational safety. And if the attachment work we'd been doing hadn't been working, then that wouldn't happen, because he wouldn't have trusted me in that moment. So while we're still sort of chasing our tail, you can also definitely see the power of the work as well, and how that growth can happen.
Absolutely.
So one of the things I think that was really fundamental in us understanding our kids, and I think in a trauma situation, is important to understand. But I also think overactive stress response systems and understanding the stress response system is important, full stop. Can I get you to dive into that for me?
Absolutely. I agree. So we're talking about a universal human phenomenon, right? We all experience fight, flight, freeze. Um, and, and I think the thing that happens for young people who have been exposed to trauma and neglect is that they develop what we call an overactive stress response system. And so for most of us, we operate, if we think about our mental state, we operate on a continuum of calm, alert, alarmed, fearful, and then kind of in a state of terror. And over the course of a day, we move up and down that continuum all the time. And depending upon what state we're in, will depend on what part of our brain is accessible, like actually physically accessible to use in that moment. And it will also impact the way in which we respond or how we cope with an experience. So I guess the thing that's really important to understand is that our brain mediates all of our functioning, and it is fundamentally all about survival. Its primary objective is survival. It's a paranoid organ. It runs around in our head, well, it doesn't run around, but it's sitting up there in our head, and it's scanning the environment persistently and consistently for potential threat. Mm. And so all of the information comes into our brain via our brainstem at the very bottom of our brain, which is just all about survival, heart rate, blood pressure, temperature, and stress response. And so if our brain decides that something is a potential threat, it will start to engage the stress response system in reactivity, and it will move us up this continuum. So state of calm is very rare. That's something that you're having when you're in the shower, you're satiated, you're safe, you may be driving the car to work on a familiar route, you're listening to music, you're able to manage your own temperature regulation, and that's where you're going to have all of your most amazing creative ideas. And the author that you couldn't remember yesterday that you were telling somebody about will pop into your head. The fact that you were arguing with your partner about 3 days ago will pop back into your head and you'll be like, oh, there it is. That's where we're at our most abstract and our most creative, but it's also really rare. Just the mere fact of getting up and having to tend to our kids of a morning, tend to our partners, go to work, moves us up the arousal continuum. And Dr. Perry affectionately says it makes us more dumb. And he doesn't mean dumb as in unable to cope. It just takes us away from that high level creativity, high level abstract thought into kind of more concrete, functional, perfunctory coping. We're managing competing demands, all of these kinds of things. And so when we move from that state of alert, which is where most of us are every day, active alert, we then move into what we call a fear response and alarm. So when we're in the alert phase, the predominant part of our brain that's still active is our cortex. So calm and alert, we're up there in our cortex and we're thinking. The minute we flip up into a state of fear, where the brain has gone, you know what, there's something really scary here, or this is threatening, and to be threatening, to be really clear, we are talking about actual threat, perceived threat. So something that you or I might not consider threatening, Mr. 8 does. So we have to be really mindful that young people who've experienced trauma and neglect will react to things that would appear benign to the rest of us. Again, which is why understanding history is really important in terms of what might be a trigger for this young one. Novelty, anything new, right? So if this had been my first podcast gig, as we opened up, you would have heard the dryness in my throat. But it's not my first gig. And so the nerves weren't as high. They're still there because this is important. Getting these messages across is really important. But it didn't take me out of my cortex like it did the first time I presented with Dr. Perry on stage, for example, where I was just like brain mush for the first 5 minutes. And so when we move up into that fearful state, we move into more of a limbic system kind of control of our brain. So now we're listening with our emotional brain. We're listening to tone of voice. We're watching body posture. We're not actually listening to content anymore. And then as we move further and further up the continuum, we move lower and lower in our brain to the point where we eventually just become reactive and completely self-protective. And I think this is the really important thing to understand, because alterations in the stress mediating neurotransmitters that happen for these kids mean that they often at their baseline start the day in a state of fear.
Yeah.
And it's our job as the grown-ups in their world to bring them back into a state of alert, which is where they're going to be able to learn and benefit from information and, develop insight as they get older and all of those kinds of things and utilize their cortex. But essentially, from the moment we move into a state of fear, our cortical functioning becomes inaccessible, biologically impossible to access. So yes, we're thinking, but we're thinking with feeling. We're thinking from that emotional part of our brain. And then, as I said, as we move further and further up, we become more and more reactive and self-protective. So how we respond then depends on one of two or three things. So we generally develop a predominant coping mechanism, and that can either be hyper-aroused, or as we traditionally used to call it in psychology, externalizing behaviors. We don't like to use, from a neurodevelopmental perspective and as a neurodevelopmental psychologist kind of now, as I think of myself, I don't like to use externalizing and internalizing anymore, because they sit in the behavioral realm when this isn't, yes, they're exhibited as behaviors, but we're talking about emotional reactivity and stress reactivity. And so as these kids go up the continuum, so we have this hyper aroused, which is externalizing, so no, protest, chuck a chair, that kind of stuff. Or we can have dissociative continuum, which is more along the lines of I'll avoid, I'll comply, I'll withdraw, and then I'll check out completely. And then we have mixed presentations where we might start off avoiding and do a little bit of compliance, and then we might flip into hyper aroused and throw a chair.
We're talking about Mr. 8 here?
Maybe. But in essence, that's what the stress response system is. And so when we think about that for all of us, you think about when you're tired, you're under stress, you're worried about that, how you're going to pay that bill. You've just had a fight with, you've had, someone's criticized you about your parenting, for instance, and then your partner says something and you two end up in a blue. And you move up the arousal continuum and you're having an argument, and you're already up the arousal continuum anyway. And maybe some of the arguments come from the fact that you're now reacting to emotions and responding to emotions. And I always use this example when I'm teaching this to people. I say, and remember that time when you were having the argument, and you've got in your cortex, in that memory bank, there are a million examples of what you're wanting to say, but you cannot get one of them off the tip of your tongue in that moment until you calm down a little bit and you move back down that arousal continuum. And then you're left with a choice. Do we go there again when the memory comes back, or do we just sit on it and let it go?
Yes. It's a really great example. And I think the really great thing about explaining that concept is that it gives us the capacity for us to understand it in ourselves, and therefore greater compassion when we're engaging in children who have experienced trauma and understanding their position. I think it's a really great example when we're in SSGs, school support group meetings for non-VIC education groups. And the teacher will say, I don't understand. I tested them, 3 days ago, and they knew it. And then I asked them again 2 days later and they couldn't tell me. And that lack of understanding that in that moment we're dealing with different levels of what's going on in their space, what's been going on in their day, what recess was like, how much food they've had, and therefore that part of their brain that contains that information, whether or not they can access it. And we can see that, across the board with all kinds of different things that they have to engage in. Sometimes they can get themselves stressed. Sometimes it's just too much.
Absolutely. We, Dr. Perry and his research team have shown that there's, depending on the state that an individual's in, we can have variations in sense of time. We can have variations in IQ. It's really quite remarkable. And this exists across the board. You can apply this to organisations, resource-rich organisations, resource-depleted organisations, thinking about stress, continue in that regard, and then reactivity and the way in which policies and processes are put in place. But fundamentally, and this happens on a multi-level parallel process kind of. And what I mean by parallel process, what I mean by that is, I come up to you and I'm stressed and I'm not super regulated. In our interaction, something happens, I respond in a particular way. It heightens your stress reactivity, which then in turn can impact the way in which you respond to the kids. And so this parallel process around how we are can impact how somebody else is with somebody else.
Yeah.
And so this really important understanding of where is everybody's state and who do I need to regulate first to make sure that in that parallel process, the little one right at the very end of this dynamic, at the front line of this dynamic, is going to experience a regulated, relational, rich interaction. And that leads with me, for example, if I'm coming up to do work with you, for example, and you see it, you see me, I arrive at your place, I've rushed from another family, I sit in my car. I sit in my car for a couple of minutes. I take the opportunity to check email in case there's anything dramatic going on at the office.
Yep.
I take some breaths. I do what I need to do to get myself into the zone of your family. And then I get out of the car and away we go, so that you're getting the regulated, rich relational experience of me that I model for you to give to your kids.
I actually was at a presentation once, and we're going back into the corporate world. So the book I'm referring to is probably in corporate speak, but it's called The Third Space, written by an Australian, about the importance of the ability to know that where you are when you are either at work, on a busy train, you've been navigating the airport, anything like that, versus the home environment that you're coming to and the person you want to be there and the connections you want to make in that space, and finding your zone in between those two to be able to put away the stress from that first space and not let it bleed into what is happening when you then come home and you are dealing with those vulnerable emotions, trauma-based or not. Little people have vulnerable emotions, and they're learning from everything they see from us. So, yeah, that third space, and then being able to show up. I'm greatly looking forward to all of the episodes we're going to be doing. We'll do a fair few episodes around practicing and learning self-regulation for co-regulation.
Awesome.
Because as I've said before, it is a learned skill, and if you don't have it yet, that's okay. It's not organic. It's not something that will just happen for you. It's very hard to work out how to switch it off and put it somewhere to be present in the moment and at the emotional needs that the child in front of you has. But we'll definitely be doing some work around that. But it is, it's intrinsic. It's what will allow you to be able to show up and connect and see moments of joy as well with your little people, instead of constant tension and stress and, getting by on mere moments. So I just wanted to mention something that's been floating around in the back of my head, and I think there's a huge power behind the new neuroscience understanding around brain development, child brain development, and the impact of trauma. And the thing I think that's really amazing about it is that, these children who have experienced trauma and they see their differences. There's absolutely nothing wrong with their mental capacity, and they see where they're not engaging in the same way as some of their peers. And the beauty of being able to explain that neuroscience to those children, even at a child appropriate level, lets them understand that this is something scientific, that their brain has, due to activities that have happened, their brain has wired differently, and that there is nothing wrong with them. They don't need to feel ashamed. They don't need to feel embarrassed. They don't need to feel guilty. And so it goes from what could be a real emotion-based conversation to something that's really clear-cut. And, I think the power of the science for them is just, it's incredible in terms of what it means for their self-esteem.
Absolutely. Carly, I was trained, so I originally trained as in CBT. Like most of us psychologists have been trained. And like my first case out in Kalgoorlie, on my first day of work, there was no way CBT was going to even, like, I remember ringing my supervisor 15 minutes into the job going, what do I do with this? And so very quickly headed off to look at other intervention approaches and have been collecting them over my entire career now. But I would fundamentally say, while I was trained at university in CBT, I'm a narrative therapist. That is the heart and soul and the core. If I have to land anywhere, I land in the narrative world. And what I love about the neuroscience is, and what I loved about narrative therapy, and what really spoke to me about narrative therapy is that the problem is the problem, the person is not the problem. And what happens for our kids is that we have a whole series of events where over time there's this building and developing understanding and shame that this is from societal responses, that this is who I am. And so, I've already got this internal working model that says I'm not worthy, I don't matter, I'm not enough. And then we add to that the kind of, developing shame that occurs where, I'm not a good kid, I'm a bad person, there's something wrong with me. And that's what I loved about narrative therapy in terms of the problem is the problem. And now we've got a neuroscientific explanation to say, not what's wrong with you, and I'm using Bruce's book title here, but it's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you. And then that takes us to a whole other piece of work, which is a whole other conversation around helping kids build compassion for the people that initiated harm to them.
Yes.
But, because that's a big part of their healing, is being able to have their real story. So we've come such a long way from when I began, where we didn't tell kids, we wrapped them up in cotton wool, we didn't tell kids about what actually really happened to them and the impacts it's had on them. And there is not a single moment where I don't end up with goosebumps and tears in my eyes when I have that privileged opportunity to share with a child their history and watch them truly get it and understand that this is not them. This is something that happened to them. It's part of their story. But it's not who they are. It's something that happened to them, and it's something that we could work at shifting and changing.
I think when we're having these neurodivergence conversations around all kinds of different disorders, having compassion for one's brain and one's life is something that goes across the board in all of these sort of circumstances, because it is very, very easy when you feel like you're different to feel like there's something wrong with you. So the power behind that information. I mean, I know with our three, we've always been age appropriately honest. And we feel that if we're proud of their story, then they can feel proud of their story. And hopefully that kind of connects itself back for them. So, and I can completely understand the perspective of wanting to shield them from things, because that's what we want to do as parents. We want to protect them, but they also, they're individuals who have the right to understand who they are and feel proud of exactly what made them who they are. So that's my belief system anyhow.
Yeah, absolutely. And I agree, Carly. I think, the idea of shielding or hiding or not telling them something until later suggests that there's something to hide, something to be ashamed of, something that we're not proud of, as opposed to, what incredible little warrior you are that you survived this, and, what a powerful little organ your brain is to take care of you in the way that it has. And, and a little bit like Mr. 8 navigates with his, this was good for me then, but it's not now. I love that at 8 years of age, he's able to say that in a way that grown adults that I work with can't. What a powerful change that, and there you go, I've got goosebumps again. What a powerful change that makes for the future, our future as a society, when our kids who would otherwise be perceived as different, problematic, behavioural, challenging, manipulative, willful, can be proud and loud about the fact that actually my brain's scared.
Yeah, exactly. And then when you get into all of that beautiful emotion work, understanding the importance of scared as well, and feeling proud that it knows that it's scared. So look, I think that in mind, it'd be really great to have a conversation. I've got some notes here from you. You wanted to touch on complex developmental trauma and
Mm,
the complication of it coming about by someone who's charged to protect you. I'm going to intersect this in a way of talking about how when you mentioned the stress response and waking up in a place of fear, I think this is a really great thing to dive into at that particular point, intersecting those two things, because if you do have that poor initial attachment, you don't believe that you're waking up into a safe space. And so, inherently you're going to wake up in a place where you're going to wonder what's happening next. But I'd love you to have a chat about that sort of that impact, what it can mean, what we can see, and how that can grow if interventions aren't actually put in place.
mm. You know, when we started and we talked about attachment and we talked about disruptions to attachment, in essence, we're talking about the beginnings of complex developmental trauma.
Mm.
And then, that's compounded then by not being able to achieve those optimal developmental experiences. Things like, having your hair brushed, being assisted in bathing, building blocks together, being taught to ride a bike, learning how to put your clothes on, do up your shoes, all of that kind of stuff. Like,
Mm.
these are all interactions that build developmental skills, build my fine motor skills, emotional regulation skills, etc., etc. And so when we think about, as a profession at the moment in the trauma world, we talk about and we use the term complex developmental trauma. Now, it's not a diagnostic label. It doesn't exist in the diagnostic manual or DSM-5 as it stands at the moment.
Mm.
The industry tried very hard to get it up in the revision from DSM-4 to DSM-5, and it still didn't get a Guernsey. What we did get, though, however, was a new trauma-related disorders section of the DSM-5, which allowed reactive attachment disorder to sit inside of that. And I often feel really stuck because the kids that I see they get a PTSD diagnosis, and if it's caught early enough, they'll also get a reactive attachment disorder diagnosis. But complex developmental trauma is really what we're talking about. And
Mm.
that is and it's complex because we've had these missed developmental experiences, but we've also had the perpetrator of harm or the activator of stress or distress is actually the person that's charged with your care.
Mm. Mm.
And so, from a psychological point and a neurobiological developmental point, that's just really confusing. Like, it just, this is someone that's supposed to love me
Mm.
and they hurt me. This is someone that I'm supposed to feel safe in the arms of, because we're all driven to have reward, have a sense of reward.
Mm.
And we're born with driven to form and maintain relationships with others.
Mm.
And so for these kids, there's this experience, for kids, adults, because we've got lots of adults with complex developmental trauma,
Mm.
where, as I said at the outset, the ability to have a sense of trust in others in the world is fragmented, broken, and disintegrated. And so, we end up with this inability to form relationships, maintain relationships. We end up in relationships where, individuals may be more people pleasing if they're on that dissociative continuum, or aggressive and assaultive if they're more on that hyper aroused continuum. Not able to regulate. So all of the things we've talked about that you get with neurodevelopmental disruptions, it's then all complexly kind of plays out in the context of relationships. And they walk around in the world where the world just feels fundamentally unsafe.
Yeah.
And relationships actually become a trigger.
Mm.
So the kids that I see, and this is where, we watch foster carers really struggle. We see well-meaning people come in wanting to care for kids with the best of intentions, and they've brought up their children, they've got lovely homes, and it's all really lovely. And they don't understand why these kids come in and they're really dissociative for the first week or two, what we call the honeymoon phase.
Yeah.
And then they unpack their bags a little bit like my foster dog did. And, it all breaks loose. and but I'm being loving, and I'm being caring, and I'm being, all of these things are just fundamental triggers for these kids, because it's different. I don't understand it. It's not my homeostasis. It's not what I know. And so it activates their stress response system, and they lash out to protect themselves in the context of the relationship.
Gosh, and it brings us back to that word behaviour as well, and how inaccurate it is to describe the complexity of what is going on for the brains of these beautiful little children, and how behaviour is merely just a survival tactic. It's literally their way of being able to protect themselves. And when you are dealing in the out of home care space, it can be such a terrible cycle, because those, as you said, those externalized behaviors that are a response to a lack of feeling safe, unfortunately, if they don't come into the hands of someone who understands, it can just push them further away. So that's a big conversation to get into, though. We won't start talking about the out of care system, because we could be here for a very long time. Very long time.
We could. Yeah. And when you raise that, then I go into what's required for treatment in my mind, and that's a whole other conversation.
And Chelle and I have had many long soapbox conversations that have ventured down into all kinds of little spaces. We won't make poor listeners go down on that journey with us on this particular occasion. But look, we have covered in certain ways while we've been talking about this some of the things that are beneficial when we see children who have experienced complex developmental trauma. So, obviously the dosing and work with a psychologist around understanding themselves, their emotions, being able to unpack their narrative. I did want to quickly, because I love how you've said that OT is the misunderstood new frontier for trauma. And I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind unpacking that for me a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. So, and this is the thing I love about, I'm so glad I was indoctrinated out in Kalgoorlie and learnt about community psychology and the importance of everybody having a role in treatment. Otherwise, this might have brushed up against me in a whole other way, and it just didn't. I just enveloped it. So it's that. So for the listeners' benefit, and I'm going to speak about my experience here, not all psychologists, but my experience of training was very much in the medical model, where there's hierarchies of treating professionals and specialists, and you are viewed as a specialist with expert knowledge, and you are trained to be a little expert, or I was trained to consider myself an expert, which I've never done. I think I know a bit about psychology, and I know a bit about neuroscience, but the real experts are, I'm an expert in what I know, and you're an expert in your children. OTs are an expert in sensory processing and motor and daily functioning. Physiotherapists are an expert in muscle and skeletal kind of stuff. And so what we know about the way the brain organizes and develops is, if we've had intrauterine or early first 1 to 2 years developmental disruptions, the primary interventions need to focus on reorganizing, because if it develops in a bottom-up manner, we've got to repair it in a bottom-up manner, right? There's no point, and this is what traditional therapy has done. We've been trying to fix kids who've had trauma histories by addressing their cortex and their limbic system, while we've still got disrupted sensory systems, motor systems, biorhythms, basic physical strength and regulatory systems. So we've got to alter those first. We've got to go about working on them first. Now, if we get a kid that's under 6, we can tackle all parts of the brain. We can throw all sorts of interventions at them, but being very thoughtful about overscheduling. Okay, so this is where I think we have to not be precious about the work that we do. And so from my perspective, and in fact, a lot of us trained in the neurosequential network will say that, and we've said it for years now, that OT is the primary intervention in many respects, and I've actually now included that since I've been doing infant mental health. So I've expanded on it, Carly, because SLP, so speech and language, probably even comes before OT. Because speech and language, we're talking about, how does a baby latch? How does the baby suck? They are the beginnings of our speech and language system. How do they swallow? How do they navigate food intake? All of that kind of stuff. So these speech language, occupational therapy, physiotherapy, all of these interventions that are designed to work at the brainstem and the diencephalon systems in the brain have to come first. They just have to. We have to. And if they're not coming first, they need to be partnered alongside. And then from a dosing perspective, and, I've talked about this a little bit in a couple of trainings I've done. But I with a few people I'm working on, and maybe at some point between now and when I retire, I'll write it up as a formalized kind of concept and idea. But I'm talking about like one intervention. How does everyone do their assessments? And then how do we come together? Yep. And how do we go, okay, this is the brain from a biologically respectful perspective. This is the brain that we need to reorganize. And we need to start here. And depending upon the age of the child, so if, in my cohort, the 0 to 5s, we might need to put a lot of diencephalic intervention in place, right? Physio, OT, speech. But we might also need to be doing some emotional regulatory work with me and maybe some understanding of self-work. But that doesn't mean that in that session with me, I can't do a little bit of physio, a little bit of OT, and a little bit of speech if I'm coached right by the other professionals. In the same vein that they can all utilise the same language that we're using about, oh, wow, it's really frustrating, isn't it, when you can't say that word? Or when you can't get your tongue in the right position. That's really frustrating. And tell me in your body, where do you feel it? In the same vein that we can hold your body nice and tight, because I can see that you're getting dysregulated as we're talking about these big feelings and this big event that happened in your life. And I know that core strength is something you're working on with your physio. And so how about you hold your body really tight and you put your hands in mine and I'll lift you up off the ground like a rocket, but you've got to stay really tight like a rocket so I can put you back down. So now you've had movement that regulates you. We've worked on your core. We're doing psychology. Like, that's my dream, is that we would have this one intervention that's about this child's brain, where we all do a little bit of each other's work, but we each have our specialty and we all input into it again.
I'm going to put a call out to any software geniuses that are listening. If you can find an incredible method of being able to bring allied health in so that they can all communicate with each other and light up different sections of the brain they're working on, I think you've got a winning model there. So I think you gave us a brilliant example of understanding this when we were understanding Mr. 8 and what had happened to Mr. 8, and it was the building the house model. And I think that it just explains it so clearly that, there's no point building a super strong, heavy roof, i.e. the cortex, if the structure, the foundations, everything that's supposed to hold up the walls isn't there in place properly. Nothing's going to stick, nothing's going to stay. So, I've always used that as the most powerful visual for being able to understand the importance of creating change in a developmentally respectful way.
Yeah, Dr. Perry's brilliant, and it's his metaphor. And he talks about you don't put a frame on a cracked slab, and you don't put drywall plaster. You don't put plaster on rotten frame, and you don't wire a house that's got cracked plaster, and et cetera, and as it goes. And mine is you don't race home from work saying you're going to cook your stepdaughter's birthday cake because you're really proud of the fact that you can bake, and you're going to cook her birthday cake and you get it out of the oven and the base layer cracks because she wants a layer cake. And you go, oh, well, I go to Woolworths and just grab another cake, or will I do, it'll be fine, I'll just stick it together with icing. And you come out the next morning and the entire cake is like crumbled into the bottom layer because the foundation was cracked.
Yes.
And so the layered cake looks a little bit kind of busted and disorganized.
Oh, Chelle, we've had such a big conversation. Look, I think there's so many more things that we can dive into in the future. Believe it or not, we've been talking for almost an hour now.
Oh my goodness.
And it's just been so incredibly informative. I do also want to say to those listening who have been picking up bits and pieces of what we've been talking about, the really amazing thing about anything you hear in any of these conversations about neurodivergence, when it talks about different kinds of interventions, is that you don't actually have to have the diagnosis to use the intervention. All of these interventions, no matter what we're talking about, are incredibly helpful and beneficial for your individual, because every single one is targeting someone who is feeling like a square peg in a round hole, and it's going to help them with those feelings and emotions. So, you know, don't feel like you can't take any of this on board and actually adapt it to what you're doing with yours. Chelle, what a privilege. Thank you. We've really gotten into some meaty brain science, and I've actually been thinking in my mind I'd really like to get a neuroscientist on to break down the brain and what each part of the brain does and really get into a nitty-gritty conversation. And having this discussion's made me think I think it's something we should definitely do, because I think it empowers us to really understand the actions of those, you know, in our care that are struggling. So I appreciate that light bulb moment. And I'm really grateful for all of the time and expertise that you've shared with us today.
No worries, Carly. Carly, I think one of the things I'd like to bring home, I think if there was a take-home message, it's a quote from Dr. Perry from a conference that he was at, and that is that the tragedy of the misunderstood, traumatised child or neglected child is that their fear-based reactivity is misinterpreted as willful, deliberate, manipulative, aggressive, violent, and done on purpose, rather than understanding that this is a fear response. These kids are persistently fearful and they're overreactive to minor challenges. Thank you so much for having me on.
I think that's a beautiful way to finish. It's a great light bulb moment for us to all take with us. So I really appreciate it, Chelle.
Thanks, Carly.
What an incredibly in-depth and insightful conversation that was. So amazing to get such detailed information about how the brain actually operates, and using that as a means not only to understand trauma, but I think it's a really broad way to start to understand neurodivergence and why people who are neurodivergent have so much difficulty when they're in an environment that doesn't actually suit the way their brain operates. I'm incredibly grateful that we've managed to have this conversation. I just wanted to take this moment to suggest that there is a lot of content in this one, and there's a lot to wrap your brain around and to think deeply about. So my suggestion here is that now that you've listened to it once, I would actually go back when you have the opportunity and listen to it a second and maybe even a third time. You may want to come back to it in a month's time and see what you get out of it then as well. I know when I was learning all about my little people's brains, it took me quite a lot of time to really understand the subtleties and the importance of knowing how their brain was going to be thinking and working at different moments to understand how they were responding. So I definitely recommend listening to this one again. Thank you so much, and I look forward to speaking to you next week, where we will be discussing dyslexia, dyscalculia, dysgraphia, and other learning disorders. Have a wonderful day. Be sure to check the show notes on our website for any links and references. You can find us at youcangrowyourownway.podbean.com. And if you found this episode helpful, we would love you to help us get the word out. You can share the podcast, tell a friend, and be sure to click the follow or subscribe button so you can access all our new episodes. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram, where we would love to connect with you. You Can Grow Your Own Way recognises Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of this place, now known as Australia. We're coming to you from Jabberung, Jawajali and Wadawurrung country, the country of our guest speaker, and from wherever you are listening. We respect the elders of the past and present, and we share our friendship and kindness.